fire has burned low, and the glasses have stopped clinking. Outside, the Russian night stretches cold and endless. But inside the Empire's halls, the counting never stops. Coins clatter, quills scratch, and somewhere a minister leans over a ledger heavy with figures and the faint smell of spilled vodka. This is no tavern. It's the Tsar's treasury. And the nation's greatest addiction isn't the drink itself, but the profit it brings. Subscribe and like the video to listen to more boring history. Because by now, vodka isn't just warming the peasants, it's funding the empire. So pour yourself something calm, tea perhaps, and let's follow the money. It leads somewhere darker than any bottle ever did. It's a curious thing that an empire which prided itself on strength, faith and discipline could balance its entire economy on a bottle. But by the 19th century, the Russian state had done just that. The empire, vast and shimmering on the map, seemed immovable. From the icy reaches of Siberia to the wheat fields of Ukraine, from the Baltic ports to the mountains of the Caucasus, Russia stretched like a sleeping giant. Yet that giant, for all its muscle, had a peculiar heartbeat, and it pulsed to the rhythm of poured vodka. By now, vodka was no longer just a drink or a social habit. It was an institution, as essential to the state as the army or the Orthodox Church. And, in many ways, it was far more profitable. The logic was simple. The empire needed money. Armies were expensive, palaces even more so. And the Tsar's ministers could always rely on one certainty. The Russian people would never stop drinking. So, the Ministry of Finance began to treat vodka not as a luxury, but as a financial pillar. The taverns, kabaks, spread like frost across the empire. From grand stone halls in St. Petersburg to wooden shacks in distant provinces, there was always somewhere to drink. And the government owned them all. Imagine it. An entire nation where nearly every tavern, every drop, every glass raised to the lips was monitored and taxed by the state. Not through moral oversight, of course, but through the far more reliable hand of revenue collection. By the middle of the 1800s, alcohol taxes accounted for nearly half of the imperial budget. Half. In some years, the figure was even higher. The Tsar could have lost an army, but not a drunk. For the drunk was, in effect, paying for the army. It was, from a fiscal point of view, a masterpiece. From a moral point of view, a catastrophe. The peasantry, bound by serfdom until 1861, spent a painful portion of their meagre wages in these state taverns. A man might labour for a month, sell his grain, and then hand his earnings back to the empire in exchange for a few warm evenings and a cold morning headache. And so the money went round and round, from hand to bottle, bottle to tax, tax to treasury, and back again. The state drank with one hand and counted with the other, but not everyone toasted to this arrangement. Reformers began to whisper that Russia's dependence on vodka was a sickness. Economists, priests, and doctors all warned that the nation was losing its vigour. "The treasury is drunk," one critic remarked, "and it will die of thirst when the bottle is empty." Still, the Tsars were unwilling to let go. Alexander V tried to reduce vodka's role, but his ministers reminded him that the empire's coffers would collapse. Alexander II, the reformer who freed the serfs, toyed with the idea of temperance, but his bureaucrats quietly shelved the plan. And so the drinking continued, dutifully, patriotically, endlessly. There was even a kind of grim efficiency to it. soldiers were encouraged to drink in moderation, though the definition of moderation was flexible. Officers toasted victory before battles, and sometimes during them. Civilians drank to endure the seasons, the taxes, and the boredom of a life measured in harvests and hardships. Foreign observers were astonished. One French journalist, visiting the empire in the 1860s, wrote that Russia was the only nation where intoxication is a civic duty. He wasn't far wrong. The taverns were not mere drinking halls. They were political tools. The government understood that a drunk peasantry was a quiet peasantry. So long as the people's frustrations ended at the bottom of a glass, rebellion could be postponed. But rebellion, like hangovers, can only be postponed so long. By the 1870s, cracks were appearing. The Industrial Revolution was creeping into Russia, belatedly, unevenly, but with force. Factories rose where fields once stood, and the empire's new working class carried their habits with them into the cities. The taverns followed, clustering near railways and mills. Now it wasn't just peasants drinking away their wages. It was factory hands, dock workers, and soldiers on leave. Vodka, that old rural companion, had gone urban. It was around this time that moralists began to speak of a vodka trap. Peasants, newly freed but still impoverished, often found themselves lured back into debt by the very taverns that promised them warmth. A man could pawn his boots, his tools, even his horse harness just to afford another glass. The state turned a blind eye. After all, debt kept people working, and drinking kept the treasury full. In the countryside, temperance movements tried to fight back. Orthodox priests preached sermons on sobriety. Doctors published alarming reports about liver disease, and idealistic school teachers distributed leaflets urging moderation. The response? Most peasants used the leaflets to light their pipes. To the Russian mind of the 19th century, vodka wasn't a sin. It was a necessity. Life was long, cold, and full of superiors who shouted orders. A drink made it bearable. The church might warn of damnation, but the tavern offered something far more immediate: warmth. There was even a superstition that vodka could ward off illness. During epidemics, villagers would gather to drink for health, a tradition that often achieved the opposite. Meanwhile, the empire's officials counted their profits with quiet satisfaction. The state monopoly became ever more centralized. Distilleries were nationalized, private competition suppressed. The government printed little booklets listing exactly how much vodka a man could drink per week without harm. Unsurprisingly, the number was generous. It's difficult to say whether anyone believed the illusion that this was sustainable. Perhaps they didn't want to believe otherwise. By the 1880s, the social consequences were impossible to ignore. Drunkenness filled prisons, emptied families, and dulled the ambitions of an entire class. One satirical pamphlet of the time described Russia as a man sleeping off a century-long hangover, and yet the taverns stayed open late. Even the reform-minded Tsar Alexander III, who prided himself on moral discipline, couldn't resist the revenue. He expanded vodka sales through government stores, insisting that orderly intoxication was better than private chaos. A strange slogan for a mighty empire. As the century drew to a close, vodka had become both the lifeblood and the weakness of the state. The empire's military, its railways, its bureaucracy, all ran on money drawn from the bottle. Without vodka, there was no empire. Without the empire, there would be no vodka. A perfect circle, spinning faster than anyone could stop it. And so the peasants drank on, generation after generation, from baptism to burial. The same bottle that blessed a newborn's name would later toast his wedding and numb his old age. To be sober in such a world was to see too much. But times were changing. The winds of reform were rising again, louder, colder, more dangerous than before. New thinkers were emerging from universities and newspapers, men who spoke not of loyalty or faith, but of justice, equality, and revolution. And among them were a few bold voices asking an even stranger question. What if Russia stopped drinking? It sounded absurd, almost unpatriotic. Yet the idea began to spread, from classrooms to barracks, from pulpits to parlours. The empire, already trembling from within, didn't realise that this small moral question would soon become a political one. Because if the people ever sobered up, even for a moment, they might finally see who had been holding the bottle. In the next chapter, we'll leave the marble halls of power and step into the smoky warmth of the kabak itself. We'll meet the peasants, the men and women who kept the empire drunk and the treasury full. And we'll see how vodka became both their comfort and their curse. And perhaps then we'll understand why no empire, no matter how vast, can stay upright forever when it's built on a bar counter.